Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We meet again. Hopefully all of you are coping well. And as I mentioned, we'll be meeting on a weekly basis, or I'll be delivering an online lecture on a weekly basis. So even though we are supposed to have classes twice in a week, for the first class I'll be delivering online lectures, and for the next class you will be given other tasks or other reading materials or other videos for you to refer to. This is also in line with the ERTL, Emergency Remote Teaching and Learning, whereby encouraged to make things easier for you, and hopefully I try my best to make things as easy as possible and not to be burdensome, because I understand that we are facing various difficulties and challenges at this current time. So last week we looked at define what is Naskh. So we looked at the issue of Naskh wa Mansukh and the verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 106, which is the premise, the overall premise for the doctrine of Naskh. However, today inshallah we will look at the controversies surrounding this concept of Naskh, and as such we will be looking at the convergence and divergence of Naskh. At the end inshallah of this lecture, it will become more clearer, because this issue of Naskh is indeed controversial, and sometimes we need to define actually what a Naskh is, and certain scholars might define it differently, which might have led to the issues or controversies surrounding a Naskh. Okay, allow me to share the slides. Prophet Tamim Usama, History and Sciences of the Quran. So mainly this is the main reference for this topic. Okay. So the proponents of the doctrine of Naskh put forward several views regarding this issue. So for example, they quote Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu. Abdullah ibn Abbas, a companion of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was also considered a mufassir. And in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replaces, annuls and retains whatever He wants. And it's up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to annul, replace or retains whatever He wishes. And in fact, Umar al-Khattab is said to that Ubay bin Ka'ab was the most knowledgeable about al-Mansukh. Umar acknowledged that Ubay was an expert in al-Mansukh, in that which is abrogated, then in the fact that al-Naskh or Nasikh and Mansukh is a valid concept. Okay, and Al-Hasan al-106 refers to what has been is still recited, meaning the hukum of those verses have been abrogated despite the verses still being present in the Quran. This is the view of Hasan al-Basri. Ad-Dahhak, on the other hand, he says that this verse in Surah Al-Baqarah speaks about Al-Nasikh and Al-Mansukh. So they use this verse as an evidence to support this idea that there can occur, or Naskh can occur when it comes to Quranic verses. And we have looked at the various types of Naskh. We have even looked to the extent that some argue that there are certain verses in the Quran which are now not included anymore in the Quran. Yeah, certain verses were revealed but then are now not included in the Quran, meaning it has been abrogated. It is not recited anymore, and the hukum also does not remain. And we have looked at an example whereby hukum remains although the verse itself is not recited anymore. So we have looked at the various types of naskh. Okay. So these are other views also which support or upholds this concept of naskh. As-Suddi, for example, argues that yes, that this verse is Surah Al-Ra'd 39, يَمْهُ اللَّهُ مَا يَشَاءُ وَيُثْبِتُ وَعِنْدَهُ أُمُّ الْكِتَابِ. That this verse is proof that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala annuls what is al-mansukh and retain what is al-nasikh. So here again to clarify, nasikh is that which abrogates, while mansukh is that which is abrogated. Okay. Al-Quradi interprets the passage of interprets this verse as coming down regarding al-nasikh and al-mansukh. Yeah. So Al-Quradi, he argues that the asbab al-nuzul or the sabab al-nuzul for this verse is basically due to al-nasikh and al-mansukh. Ibn al-Jawzi, he believes that there is an ijma' and a consensus among the ulama on the validity of naskh in the Quran, while An-Nahas declares that those who reject an-naskh to be in a state of indecision due to their disagreement with the ijma'. Yeah. So these scholars basically uphold the concept of naskh and argue that it is possible for a naskh to appear when it comes to the Quran. So despite the views favoring a naskh, scholars differed in their opinion, regarding to the number of abrogated verses. So how many verses have actually been abrogated? So that issue arises. So if we agree that a naskh is valid, that this concept is valid, then let's move on. How many verses have actually been abrogated? And since there are differences of opinion when it comes to the number of verses which have been abrogated or which are mansukh, it gives rise to further arguments on the issue, because there is, on one hand you say there is a consensus about naskh, but then there is a difference when it comes to the number of verses which have been abrogated. So for example, Muhazzam said 214 passages have been abrogated. An-Nahas says that 134 verses have been abrogated. Yeah. Al-Baghdadi says that 134 verses have been abrogated. Ibn says have been abrogated. Shahwali says that only 5 have been abrogated. So due to the differences have been exercised to the arguments on this issue of an. So Shahristani, he discussed this issue of naskh on rational grounds, and abrogated all other previous scriptures. Yeah. So he confesses that abrogation is not an innovation but is a continuous process of change of law which culminates in Islam. And he raises an interesting question: if the contemporary law is subject to constant alteration to meet the changing conditions, why is it impossible that laws given in one time should be abrogated elsewhere at another time? So according to Ash-Shahristani, the law corresponds to action and the active changes of death and life, man's creation and annihilation, sometimes gradually, sometimes instantaneously, correspond to the legal changes of the lawful and the prohibited. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders man's action as he pleases, and he must not be asked about what he is doing. So according to Ash-Shahristani, if we consider the formation of man from his full stature, we see that each progressive form abrogates his preceding form. Likewise, man progresses from code to code till the perfection of all codes is reached. Nothing lies beyond it except resurrection. Yeah. So basically, Shahristani brings this concept of Naskh to a broader picture, in which he says that the Quran abrogates all previous scriptures. Okay. Imam Shafi'i, on the other hand, discusses the doctrine of Naskh in detail. Yeah, in his book Al-Risala, and he argues that the Quranic injunctions can be abrogated only by the Quran and Sunnah by the Sunnah. So the Sunnah cannot abrogate the Quran, yeah, and vice versa. Yeah. And Imam Shafi'i also argues that the Prophet ﷺ was ordered to follow the revelation and not change the Quran itself. Yeah. So Prophet ﷺ was ordered to follow what was revealed to him, and he cannot change the Quran. And only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can change revelation. So Ibn Kathir cautions that those who followed the Jews on the doctrine of Naskh are in a state of kufr, or disbelief, yeah, whereby the Jews denied a Naskh, yeah, the Jews denied a Naskh in spite of its occurrence even in the earlier scriptures and the laws of the past, such as God made lawful to the Prophet Adam alayhi salam the marriage between his daughters and sons and then prohibited it. Likewise, Nuh alayhi salam was permitted to consume the meat of all animals after his exit from the ship or of the ark, and later some provisions were cancelled. Yeah. So here again, Ibn Kathir says that the Jews deny an-Naskh, and those who denies an-Naskh would be similar to the Jews and are considered to be disbelievers. Yeah. And Nahas further argues that an-Naskh does not involve change in divine will. Does it actually mean Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides about something, then suddenly changes his mind and decides on something else? Yeah. According to An-Nahas, that is not the case. Yeah. So he says, An-Naskh then does not involve any change in the divine will, rather God's recognition of the fact that the situation of the human being would change over time. So God knew at the outset what these changes would be, and he knew it would eventually become necessary to abrogate the original command or prohibition. Yeah. So here Nahas argues that abrogation does not validate the argument that God changes his mind and that God does not know what is happening in the future, and as such then changes law according to current circumstances at that time. Yeah. So according to An-Nahas, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is well aware of what is happening, and as due to the gradual transformation of human beings, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also gradually revealed certain verses and abrogated some of them. So Al-Taba Taba'i, on the other hand, yeah, notion of abrogation, that is cancelling of one law by another, is based on the idea that a new law is needed because of a mistake or shortcoming in the previous one, it is clearly inappropriate to ascribe a mistake in law making to God. Yeah. So here he says that the common notion of abrogation, which ascribes that God mistake, is not actually valid. Yeah, it is not actually valid. So he further argues that in the Quran, the abrogating passages mark the end of the validity of the abrogated passages because their need and effect was of temporary or limited in nature. In time, the new law appears and announces the end of the validity of the earlier law. That the Quran was revealed over a period of 23 years in ever-changing circumstances, it is not difficult to imagine the necessity of such laws, and it is in this light that the wisdom of Naskh within the Quran should be regarded. So similarly to An-Nahas, he argues that the doctrine of Naskh does not actually point to the fact that God made a mistake in revealing certain verses which inherently imposes certain laws on us. Yeah, it is not a mistake, but it is due to the changes over time in which the Quran was revealed, which necessitated the changes in law, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the very is aware of such. Yeah. So those are the arguments in defense of Naskh, in defense of this doctrine of abrogation. Of Naskh in the Quran as or myth, yeah, and ayah or forgotten accepts that he that which is better or similar. Yeah, this is the verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 106, which we have mentioned again and again. Yeah, and in Surah An-Nahl 101, Allah says, وَإِذَا بَدَّلْنَا آيَةً مَكَانَ آيَةٍ وَاللَّهُ أَعْلَمُ بِمَا يُنَزِّلُ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا أَنْتَ مُفْتَرٍ بَلْ أَكْثَرُهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. Okay. So here Allah says, when we substitute one revelation for another, and Allah knows best what He reveals in stages, they say, thou art but a forger, but most of them understand not. Yeah. So here, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replaces the hukum inherent in a verse with another hukum inherent in another verse, people might accuse the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as a forger, yeah, muftar. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that those who claim so or accuse the Prophet ﷺ of doing so are people who do not understand. Okay, so those who disagree with this concept of Naskh says that these verses does not refer to the text of the Quran per se, but to the previous scriptures, meaning that the Quran came down to abrogate the rules which were established in the previous scriptures. Yeah, meaning that one verse would abrogate another verse of the Quran in itself, but the Quran as a whole came and abrogated the previous scriptures. Yeah, and that the theory of Naskh does not originate from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They argue this. Yeah, they argue that a Naskh does not originate from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for there is no authentic report from him as to the existence of abrogated passages in the Quran in the sense that the scholars understood it. Yeah. So according to them, had any passage of the Quran been actually abrogated, the Prophet ﷺ would have definitely indicated it. Yeah. And they underline that as the teachings of the Quran are everlasting and eternal, it is inconceivable that the Prophet ﷺ had left such a critical issue to the discussion of the companions or later generations. Yeah? And this view is further substantiated by the fact that the companions themselves are reported to have differed among themselves with regard to the abrogation of certain passages in the Quran. Yeah? So another argument against Naskh occurring in the Quran is that we do not find any sahih or authentic accounts from the Prophet ﷺ himself uh, indicating that this ayah has been abrogated or that this ayah abrogates another ayah. So there is there is no such authentic report. And because this is a matter of importance, uh, uh, the Prophet ﷺ should have indicated it, yeah, if indeed a naskh is valid. Yeah. And we've mentioned also the companions differed in relation to abrogation of certain passages in the Quran, yeah, even and because there are differences of opinion on the matter, as we have seen in our lecture last week. For example, Omar mentioning that stoning was in fact mentioned in the Book of Allah, yeah, but we do not find any other supporting evidences in favor of such an opinion. So while some scholars, yeah, claim that an-naskh, that there is an ijma' on an-naskh, or yani, that scholars have agreed to this doctrine of an-naskh, others argue that the differences regarding an-naskh manifest that it was the result of qiyas and conjecture and not ijma'. Yeah. So according to them, it is not ijma', but it is based on qiyas. It is based on qiyas and adhan. Yeah, not ijma'. So there is also an argument that had there been ijma' on the issue of an-naskh, then why are there several inconsistencies with regard to the exact number of abrogated passages? Yeah, we've mentioned this just now, due to the differences in number. Yeah, when it comes to verses which have been abrogated, this gives rise to people doubting whether is there truly an ijma', yeah, a consensus on this issue of an-naskh. So modern scholars like Sheikh Muhammad Abdu, he accepts an-naskh in principle, however denies an-naskh in passages of the Quran, meaning that in principle he agrees that the Quran was revealed and abrogates previous scriptures, but he does not agree that it is present, or he does not consider it valid. He does not consider naskh valid when it comes to verses of the Quran. Said Ahmad Khan, yeah, also claims that a naskh in the Quran is unscientific and illogical. Yeah. And according to Said Ahmad Khan, the word naskh in the passage of Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 106, refers to abrogation of the previous quotes revealed to the prophets of the past, which conforms to other arguments as well. Yeah, which conforms to arguments by other scholars who would disapprove of a naskh in the passages of the Quran. Al-Isfahani establishes that all instances of the so-called naskh in the Quran are in fact no more than takhsis of one text by another. So according to Al-Isfahani, the word ayat in Surah Al-Baqarah verse 106 not a portion of the Quranic text but a miracle. So the word ayah used in Surah An-Nahl too lexically means miracle. Ayah here means miracle rather than verse. Yeah, rather than verse. So according to Al-Isfahani, takhsis means that one revelation explains in more detail or according to specific circumstances how another revelation should be understood. Yeah, so it's not a matter of one verse or one hukum replacing the other, but explaining it in further detail. Yeah. So we've mentioned just now the issue of an-naskh and also takhsis, especially when we mentioned al-Isfahani. Yeah, we mentioned Isfahani. So takhsis here basically means to specify, yeah, to specify rather than to abrogate. Yeah, rather than to abrogate is basically to specify or to explain. So they argue that there is a confusion, yeah, confusion regarding an-naskh and takhsis. Why? Because there is a conceptual difference between the Hanafis and the majority of the ulama, yeah, and the Jumhur regarding naskh, in that they tend to view naskh differently from one another. So there is this divergence of opinion when it comes to naskh, to understanding what actually is naskh, yeah. The Hanafis, for example, do not consider certain verses to abrogate other verses, but they prefer to argue that the verse which seems to abrogate the other verse are in fact takhsis in nature and not abrogating. Yeah, and not abrogating. So it has been argued that the change in the meaning of the term an-naskh in different phases of the development of the doctrine is responsible for a good deal of confusion. It is observed that some companions and the early authorities had used the word in the sense of exception, particularizing the meaning, yani takhsis, and the clarification of previous passage. Yeah. So according to the author here, yeah, the issues or the controversies surrounding naskh is how to define naskh. So at different phases or different stages, a naskh has been defined differently. So accordingly, what the companions mentioned as a naskh is actually takhsis and not a naskh abrogation as commonly understood. So it is claimed that when they, yani the companions, stated that a certain passage was nasikh, yani that a certain passage was abrogating for another, they intended thereby that the passage explained and removed the misconception that could arise from a certain passage by comparing it with earlier related one. Yeah, so they did not mean that the latter revelation has totally abrogated and rendered out of force the former one. Yeah, so these different meanings of this word and the word naskh were however confused in the later ages, and no distinction was drawn between them. Yeah. So indeed, there are various verses in the Quran which in nature, while others would address certain issues in more detail, but this does not mean that the verses which has which have more details would abrogate the verses which were more general in nature. Okay. So what is the and some others then argue that there is a difference between a naskh and takhsis, yeah, in that a naskh is confined to the Quran and Sunnah and could only be affected by the explicit ruling of divine revelation, yeah, or a definitive ruling that is qat'i can only be abrogated by another qat'i ruling, and two rulings are genuinely in conflict. Yeah. So when it comes to naskh, yeah, what is the difference between a naskh as generally or commonly understood and takhsis? Yeah. So these are the differences. So you have, for example, those who are in favor of naskh arguing that it is confined to the Quran and Sunnah. Yeah, and that it could only be affected by the explicit ruling of divine revelation. Okay, let me read to you here. So this will become clearer, inshallah. It is quite evident that some Quranic pronunciations are general, while others explain and fix their meanings. Meaning, this is the meaning of the saying that the Quran explains itself. These explanatory passages seem to have been called an-nasikh if the reports are genuine in the early days. As already stated, an-naskh is basically confined to the Quran and Sunnah and could only be affected by the explicit ruling of divine revelation. At-takhsis, on the other hand, could also occur by means of rationality and circumstantial evidence. An-naskh, in other words, can only occur by shar'i, yani by shar', divine injunction, whereas at-takhsis can occur by rationality, aql, custom, urf, and other rational proofs. It will follow from this that at-takhsis, yani specifying or qualifying a general text, is possible by means of speculative evidence such as qiyas and hadith ahad. But in the case of naskh, it is a definitive ruling that is a qat'i, can only be abrogated by another qat'i ruling. Abrogation, in other words, is basically not operative with regard to speculative rulings. Yeah. So here the argument is, when it comes to naskh, it is abrogation by a verse of the Quran, yeah, for another verse of the Quran. So that verse is qat'i, and it abrogates another verse which is qat'i as well. Yeah. While when it comes to takhsis, there is room for qiyas, for analogy, or custom to play a role when it comes to takhsis. Yeah, this is another argument when it comes to the differences between an-naskh and takhsis. And an-naskh only occurs if there is genuine conflict between two rulings. Yeah, it must be genuine. The conflict must be genuine. For example, initially it was halal, now it is haram, or vice versa. It is haram and now it is halal. Takhsis, on the other hand, does not deal with such genuine conflicts between the hukum, or between the ahkam in question. Okay, it is just a matter of specifying and particularizing. So what can we conclude? We can conclude that there is a controversy over this doctrine of naskh. Yeah. Having said that, all agree on the change of rulings in the Quran. Yeah. Even those who do not support the doctrine of naskh agree that rulings change due to changing circumstances. Yeah. And the differences mainly lie in how one would term the change. Is it actually naskh or is it actually takhsis? Personally, I'm in favor of takhsis rather than a naskh, because to support the idea of naskh as understood or commonly understood is a bit problematic, and to resort to takhsis is a better option. This is my personal opinion. So again, this is just to illustrate that there is a controversy when it comes to the doctrine of naskh. There are those who support it and they have their arguments, and there are those who oppose this concept, and they also have their arguments, yeah, especially when we are talking about Naskh, when it comes to passages in the Quran itself. But when it comes to a Naskh, meaning that the Quran abrogates previous scriptures, there is no issue about that. All agree that such can occur. But when it comes to certain passages of the Quran abrogating other passages of the Quran, then many issues arises, because, for example, there is no consensus on the number of verses which have actually been abrogated, and also what the companions term as a naskh actually is takhsis. So it is all a matter of how this term a naskh is being used and being employed. And if it, and in today's age and time, or in the modern period, if we mention naskh, it means abrogation. And as such, if we support that concept of abrogation as commonly understood, it would be problematic. And as such, it is preferable to adopt the view that it is not naskh as commonly understood today, but it's actually takhsis. Yeah, it is actually takhsis, because we've put forward certain arguments against the concept of naskh, and I am personally more convinced with those arguments. You might have your own stand or own arguments, that is not a problem, but we must appreciate the fact that there are controversies, that there are differences of opinion regarding the concept of naskh, and mainly these differences of opinion is due to the fact that defining what naskh actually is the core to solving this problem. Yeah. So if we agree that a naskh as employed by the companions of Prophet ﷺ or the earlier generation was meant to be actually takhsis, then we would not have any problem, and the issue inshallah can be resolved. Okay, I know this is a bit confusing. However, I hope you would read more on this issue of naskh or nasikh and mansukh to make things clearer. But again, if you have any issues, questions, please do not hesitate to inform me by any means, and we can discuss this further inshallah. Okay, I think that is sufficient for today. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله العظيم لي ولكم. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive me for my shortcomings, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for tuning into this lecture. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Stay safe, everyone.